So Japan is in this series of wars that lasts for a very long time, that has over 200 sides duking it out to see who's going to be on top. And the person who wins is a man by the name of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Now, if you were to ask why Tokugawa Ieyasu was the winner, I would have to say, well, please take my modern Japan class, because we'd go into detail about that. But if you were to ask him, I think he would say in one word, patience. The guy was just this amazingly patient person who knew how to use whatever resources he had at hand the most effective way, and often knew when it was best not to fight. In addition, he was also just really lucky, and he happened to have a lot of sons, and his sons tended to be very loyal to him. Sons were much less likely than just random generals to just overthrow you. So he is able to unify Japan. He is clearly the most powerful samurai, and so he will be named shogun by the emperor. And what ends up happening is that Tokugawa Ieyasu will consider or continue a process started by the man before him, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who also was never named shogun but got darn close. But unfortunately for him, did not have he only had one son who was 5 when he died, allowing Tokugawa Ieyasu to take control. But Tokugawa Ieyasu will continue Hideyoshi's attempt to freeze Japanese society. Their focus is on stability, right? They've just been through almost 150 years of civil wars. They want stability, right? They want peace. So as part of this, the daimyo and the samurai will become hereditary officials, right? So not only do they become government officials, and this is something that makes them very different from China, they become hereditary officials, right? So what ends up happening is, instead of having scholar officials who get their positions because they have passed exams on Confucianism, which is what you have in China, as we'll talk about later, it's very similar to what you have in Korea, they have officials who are soldiers. And they're soldiers, and they hold those positions because their fathers and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers had those positions. And the same thing happens with the daimyo. So in order to bring stability, there's this attempt to freeze society, to say everyone in society has a place. They will always have that place. And it's interesting, you may remember we talked about how in China they had this system where you had the scholar officials on top because they govern society. Below them you have the peasants because they grow the food we need. Below them you have the artisans because they make what we need. And then last, and certainly least, you have the merchants who we don't really trust, but we kind of recognize we need them somewhat because we need stuff to move around. The Japanese accept that, but they replace scholars officials with samurai, right? And like I said, these are hereditary positions. In China, remember, through the exam systems, you could have social mobility. Theoretically, a peasant could take the exams and become a government official. Not in Japan during this time period. Society is meant to be frozen in order to bring stability. Now, you recall I talked about how it's not until the 19th century that Japan is going to become more centralized than China. The China under the Chinese emperor had this very centralized government. Japan, because of the mountains and the islands and so forth, even though they had a fairly unified cultural identity, they did not have a strong political unity, right? Which is why they could fall into the civil war that lasted a long time. And the answer to this problem of building political unity into a divided country was what we would call centralized feudalism. And if you're a student of medieval history, you say, well, that's an oxymoron. That's a paradox. You can't have centralized feudalism because feudalism is by its nature decentralized. And I will say to you that Japan managed to figure out a way to do it because they were very creative at adapting and adopting and developing their own ideas and so forth. So Japan will develop this system of centralized feudalism. So in this slide, I want to say what is centralized about this. Well, first of all, the Tokugawa directly controlled most land and most mines in Japan. So silver mines, copper mines, as well as the richest farmland were under the control of the Tokugawa family. Remember, this is a dynasty that will pass on its the position of shogun in according to this hereditary system, right? Remember, everything's hereditary. Your social class is determined by birth. You can't move around as easily as you could in China. And this Tokugawa, so they control all this, and of course that allows them to mint coins, for example, because they control those mines. This is also centralized because the Japan is divided into different domains still. There's all these different domains headed by daimyo, but the Tokugawa shogun can pick up and move those daimyo to different domains. So if the shogun's thinking you're doing a good job and wants to reward you, he could move you to a bigger domain. If he thinks you're doing a bad job and wants to punish you, he could move you to a smaller domain. And in particular, the shogun was very careful to make sure that the most loyal daimyo were the ones closest to his own lands, and the least loyal were the ones far away. So that's powerful, right? You can literally just move around these daimyo. And the Tokugawa, especially early in their rule, did do that, right? They did reassign daimyo to different domains. In addition, there was also a system of what's called alternate attendance. And alternate attendance required that a daimyo spend 1 year in the capital of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and then 1 year back in his home domain, right? So you would be in your domain 1 year, your daimyo, and then you have to travel to Tokugawa or to Edo, and you would stay there for a year, and then you would come back. And this had there's a couple important points about this. First of all, of course, this just cost a lot of money because the daimyo had to maintain 2 households instead of just one in Edo and one in their home domain. And it cost a lot of money to travel because you couldn't just do this on your own. A daimyo didn't travel alone. You would bring all these warriors with you and you had to go in style. And money that's being spent doing this is not money being spent on rebelling. In fact, there would be not a single successful samurai rebellion in this Tokugawa dynasty until the last one until basically 1868 when the system is overthrown. Or I should say more properly the 1860s. So this works well for over 200 years. In addition, when you traveled to Edo, you visited your family in Edo, including your heir. Remember, this is a hereditary system. When you went back to your domain, your family stayed in Edo. So if you were to go back to your domain and try and rebel against the shogun would just immediately kill your family, including your heir. Now, this was never tested because no one was so foolish enough to try and rebel because they knew the shogun would totally do it. But in this way, the shogun can bring stability, right? The daimyo are spending all this money to go back and forth between their domains and between the capital. And like I said, in general, they have to do this every other year. And they have to maintain a household in Edo, and their family stays there. So, it's just very difficult for them to rebel. They're spending all this money, and they know if they rebel, their family, including their heir, will die. One other centralized aspect of this was in the past, the domains had been allowed, no one could stop them, I shouldn't say allowed, but the domains had often built many castle towns. They had fortified many strategic areas in their home domains. But the Tokugawa does not allow them to do that anymore. They're only allowed to have one castle town in each domain. So if they did rise up in rebellion, you would just have to take that one castle town and the rebellion would be over. And this worked really, really well. This will allow the Tokugawa to maintain control for over 200 years, right? From about 1603 till the early 1860s. And then in 1868, they're finally overthrown. So this works really, really well, this centralized part of centralized feudalism. So you might ask yourself, well, geez, there's over 200 domains. Why did the domains accept this deal? Right? Why would they put up with this? Right? Why don't they unite against the Tokugawa? Well, and this is where the feudal part comes in, because the domains still kept a lot of their power. Right? Now, first of all, we just have to remember flat out, the shogun is still the most powerful guy there. He has the most land. If you don't want to do what he says, he can just invade you on his own. But he'll probably also have a bunch of allies too. So we have to remember that the shogun does really have a lot of just raw military power. But you can't just rule through the stick. You can't just beat people into submission. A government that just tries to control people through only power without any kind of compromise is not going to last long. And this system, like I said, lasts over 200 years. So it was, in a sense, a balance of power. So the domains, and remember, the domains are headed by the daimyo, have their own particular powers. For example, domains did not pay taxes to the central government. A daimyo, while expected to give gifts to the shogun, did not have to pay taxes to the shogun, and were allowed to tax their own lands and generally run their own lands as they saw fit. That's a lot of power. In fact, the domains often had their own law codes and enforced them themselves. So again, you can almost think of these domains as almost like little countries, right? They have a lot of power. They don't even pay taxes directly to the shogun. But also, so that's one reason why they're willing to support this system, because they don't just lose. They get some benefits. There is a compromise. In addition, and this is also key, remember that even though there's over the daimyo during the Sengoku period, during the time of the country at war, were afraid because they faced both possibilities of internal rebellion. Samurai were not always loyal, and they might rebel. Remember, that's what happened to poor Oda Nobunaga. And they were also afraid that a larger domain might invade them. So in particular, if you were a smaller domain, smaller daimyo, you knew that you probably weren't ever going to become shogun, and you knew there was a good chance that either your own samurai would rebel against you, or you would face an external invasion. But the shogun guaranteed protection for your domain, because if he recognized you as the daimyo. So if your samurai were to rebel against you, then the shogun would come in and destroy them. And in fact, until the 1860s, I believe, there are no cases of samurai actually rebelling against their own daimyo because they knew that the shogun would come in and destroy them. In addition, there are no cases until the 1860s or so of one daimyo invading another daimyo because, again, they knew that the shogun would invade and destroy them if they did. So the domains were willing to accept Tokugawa power because they were allowed to maintain a lot of their own power. They were allowed to kind of run their own lands as they saw fit. And the shogun dealt with their serious issue of protecting them against possible internal rebellion and external invasion. And this system worked really, really well. Like I said, it lasted from about 1603 till the 1860s. Now, we need to talk about how the Tokugawa are going to try and establish stability and about their foreign relations. So you may remember I talked about Catholicism. There were actually several 100,000 Catholics in Japan in the early 17th century. And there were a good number, significant number of Catholic daimyo and Catholic samurai. And the Tokugawa did not trust Catholics. The Tokugawa were afraid that the Catholics could unify around the idea of God and work together to overthrow the Tokugawa. The Catholics did not do this. They didn't plan to do this, certainly. But the Tokugawa didn't want to take any chances, and so said, we need to get rid of Catholicism. And this led to the execution, the martyrdom of thousands of Catholics, because they were seen as a bad foreign influence, right? They're connected to the Pope in Rome and to Europeans. And they're also seen as possibly being a unifying force for rebellion. In addition, whereas during the time of war, the Japanese had welcomed merchants from Portugal and later the Spanish, and then eventually the Dutch, they will close their doors to Catholic Europe because, of course, Catholic Europe brings Catholic missionaries, and there's a fear that by bringing foreign influence, this could lead to instability. And remember, now they wouldn't have known about this because it didn't happen, but this is just a clear example. Remember that China suffered a huge rebellion when Protestant Christianity came in and influenced Hongshu Quan. So there was this fear, right, that if you allow foreign influence, it could lead to instability, it could lead to rebellion. In particular, the Japanese were worried because they knew that the Spanish had conquered the Philippines, right? And the Spanish were very public and open about the fact that they were a Catholic country. And so the Japanese were afraid that if they kept their doors open to Europe, and they allowed for a Catholic population to live in Japan, that could lead to the Spanish invading them and trying to take them over, just like they had invaded and taken over the Philippines, right? So the Japanese decide to close a door to Europe to end trade with Catholic Europe and to try and destroy Catholicism. As an aside, they don't successfully completely destroy Catholicism, though they do drive it underground. But there will be Catholics secretly practicing their faith for a couple hundred years until the middle of the 18th or middle of the 19th century. But the key point is the Japanese will close a door to Catholic Europe because they are afraid that that this could lead to, if they allow Catholicism, if they allow continued relations with European countries, especially, like I said, Spain and Portugal, which are very Catholic, this could lead to invasion, rebellion, instability. However, it must be stressed that while the Japanese would close a door to Catholic Europe, they opened a window to the Protestant Dutch, right? They opened a window to the Protestant Dutch, right? The Dutch will be allowed to come and trade in Japan in a tiny little island in southern Kyushu, which is about as far south as you could get in this time period and still be in Japan, very far away from Edo. Remember, that's exactly what the Chinese did, right? Remember, the Chinese confined the European merchants or sought to confine them to Canton, to Guangdong, which was far away from Beijing. The Japanese are doing the exact same thing. It's just a strategy, right? So the Japanese will allow the Protestant Dutch to occupy the island of Dejima in southern Japan, far away from Edo. Now you may say, well, why would you do this if the Japanese are so afraid of foreign influence? Why would they do this? Well, first of all, they wanted to keep an eye on the Europeans, right? They didn't want to open a door that would let them come through and invade Japan, but they wanted to keep an eye on them, so they wanted to open a window, right? Let's make sure that we know what those Europeans are doing so that if they do try and invade us, we will be ready for them. Now, why the Dutch? The Dutch were Protestants, and there weren't any Japanese Protestants in this time period, so there was no invasion. There was this fear that the Catholics might help the Spanish if they invaded. Well, there's no fear that the Japanese Protestants would help the Dutch if they invaded because there were no Japanese Protestants. And the Dutch promised not to conduct missionary work. And they were put on this little tiny island, which is about a mile long. It wasn't even a mile long. It was a tiny, tiny island. And they weren't allowed off the island except for, I think, once or twice a year to go visit the shogun to give him the news of Europe. So the Dutch will be given the Japanese news of Europe so that they can know what's up. So the Japanese will know if the Europeans are planning on invading. So this foreign policy or foreign relations, I should say, allows the Japanese to try and protect themselves from foreign influence while also keeping a guard against possible invasion. What's also very important about the Dutch, though, is that they bring books. And the Tokugawa is very open to gaining knowledge from the outside world and will allow for Dutch books to be brought into Japan so long as they don't talk about Christianity. And so the Dutch are leaders in European science, so Japanese will be exposed to things like books on anatomy, books on medicine, even books on how to make a primitive battery, right, like an electric battery. And so many Japanese people will understand that the Europeans are very advanced in terms of science and technology, and this will make it a little bit easier for the Japanese to adjust to Western learning later on. Now, we also need to briefly talk about how Japan related to other Asian countries. Japan will have strained relations with China because they claim to have an emperor. They claim to be equal to China, and that, remember, China doesn't want to see anyone as its equals. But they will maintain some kind of informal relations. There will be some trade between the two countries. Korea will often send missions, not tribute missions, but send missions to Japan. And the Koreans, as we'll talk about later, tried to follow a policy of friendly relations where they just tried to make sure that Japan would not invade them. Now, Japan would call these tribute missions and claim the Koreans were offering tribute, but they didn't do that. They certainly didn't understand themselves as doing that because the Koreans saw themselves as actually better than the Japanese, though they were willing to accept a kind of equality in terms of diplomatic relations just so the Japanese would not invade them. Right? We'll talk about later why they were so concerned about that. But Japan did have formal diplomatic relations with Korea, and during the Tokugawa period, got along pretty well. There is also a place called, you may have heard of Okinawa, part of the Ryukyu Islands during this time period. That was an independent country. And they also sent missions to Japan to maintain diplomatic relations and also to engage in trade. So Japan did talk with other Asian countries, China basically informally, Korea and the Ryukyu Islands more formally. Now I'm going to backtrack a little bit, because we had talked about how there was this drive for stability. If you want to understand what Japan is trying to do during this time period, right, it's trying to make things stable so you're not going to have a repetition of those civil wars. And one thing I think is fascinating, remember the Europeans had brought in matchlocks. They had brought in advanced Western firearms, and the Japanese got really good at using them. And this is a picture that shows how the Japanese had figured out how to use them, right? They've built this kind of bamboo breastworks, which makes it so it's harder for samurai or cavalry to get at you, and then they sit behind and fire. And you notice that there's multiple lines of matchlock soldiers there, so they can take turns firing, right? You can have one guy fire, one other guy reloads. And these were used during the Sengoku period, the period of the country at war. And the Japanese learned how to make these. So they started producing them themselves. They also produced cannons and things like that. But they'll stop making them during the Tokugawa period. And they will stop developing and advancing. Now they could have, right? They could have continued to perfect and develop these weapons and eventually develop more, muskets and then rifles and so forth. But they stopped doing so in the name of stability, right? The problem with guns is that it only takes a couple days to learn how to use a musket, right? You could train a bunch of give peasants a bunch of guns and train them for a few days, and they can kill samurai just fine. But to be a samurai takes a long time. You got to learn how to use a sword and things like that. And the samurai are supposed to be on top, but they're not on top of just a simple peasant can pick up a gun and shoot them. So Japan will stop making guns, essentially. They will stop developing military technology in the name of stability. Right? That's how important stability is to them. And one thing we have to stress, whatever you think of this policy of relative international seclusion, of persecution of religious minorities, one thing we have to emphasize is this does bring peace and stability. The population of Japan, just like what you had happening in China, will skyrocket. Right? We'll go from 12 million to 30 million throughout the 17th century. The agriculture will first recover from the damage done during the wars, the Sengoku Wars, the period of country at war, and then will actually develop even further, thanks in part to new crops like potatoes from the Americas. Incidentally, there is a shrine to the Japanese man who supposedly first brought in sweet potatoes. It is shaped like a giant sweet potato. Or rather, there's like a statue there like a giant sweet potato. Also, remember so Japan will get wealthier in terms of food. Remember how we talked about how now you can't have multiple castle towns. Each daimyo can only have one. And all the samurai are supposed to live there, right? Samurai used to live in the countryside. Now they have to live in this one castle town or in Edo. Well, that leads to urbanization. Now you suddenly have all these Japanese people concentrated together in the same space. That leads to a growth in culture, right? Theaters, dramas, and that sort of thing. There will also be remember that there was this alternate attendance, and that's required for the daimyo to go back and forth between Edo, Tokyo, right, and their home domain. Well, you have to build roads. And now you've got these samurai and these daimyo moving all over the country on these good roads, and other people can use the roads like peasants and merchants. And now you got all these people living in cities. You're going to have lots of commercial development, right? Japanese people are going to start engaging increasingly in commerce. Right? There had always been Japanese merchants, but now there's going to be even more of them. Right? You have all these samurai living in cities, and they need something to do. They need entertainment. And, connected to this, there'll be this growth in literacy. More and more Japanese people will learn how to read, and there'll be like a production of novels as well. And because Japanese people are moving around doing all this, right, there's going to be a spread of Japanese culture and an even deeper sense of Japanese identity. Right? So you're a samurai. You go to Edo, you pick up some novels, you learn about the latest fashion, you learn about some dramas. You bring all that back when you go home. And you share that with the samurai who are back home, and then the peasants take part, the merchants take part, and so forth. So there's also a deepening spread of Japanese culture and a deepening sense of Japanese identity. However, there's going to be a couple problems that come out of this. First of all, because of this increasingly commercial economy, merchants are going to get incredibly rich, and the samurai will become increasingly in debt to those merchants. Now, that's already a problem, right? Because you have one group of people getting very wealthy and you've got one group of people becoming poor. But here's the other problem. The merchants, remember, are low in the status group. Merchants are despised. They're looked down upon, and the samurai are supposed to be on top. But we've got this topsy-turvy situation where people who are supposed to be low on the social status are in power over the people who are supposed to be high, right? You know, when you owe someone money, they have some power over you. So this is a serious problem. The people who are supposed to be in charge are losing money, losing power. The people who are supposed to be on bottom are getting rich and are having control because they've loaned money to the people, to the samurai who are now in debt. Now, it's very complex why this happens. I'm not going to go too much into it, but I do want to note, remember, this system, this social system is theoretically frozen. If you're a poor samurai, you're a poor samurai. You can't, it's not simply the samurai class that is frozen. It is the gradations within the samurai class. So if you're a powerful samurai, your kids are going to be powerful samurai and your grandkids are going to be powerful samurai. But if you're a poor samurai, and there were lots of poor samurai, right? Just the common soldiers, for example, your kids are going to be poor samurai. And they may say, I don't want to be a poor samurai, Dad. I want to go become a merchant because merchants can make money. You'll say, well, that's nice, son, but we're not allowed to do that. So not only are the samurai having a problem because they're increasingly becoming in debt to merchants who they're supposed to be above in the social status hierarchy, there's absolutely nothing they can do about it. Right? There's absolutely nothing the samurai can do about it. They're not allowed, they can't go up to a higher position because those positions are frozen. They cannot become a merchant or a peasant to try and make a living. They're stuck being poor samurai. There's absolutely nothing they can do about it. And what's striking is, so what's striking then is that you have this system where these samurai are stuck. They're supposed to be on top. They're supposed to be powerful, but they're not. They're running out of money. They're becoming in debt to merchants, and they're not allowed to really do anything about it. And adding to that problem is that while things were very good in the 17th century, starting the late 18th century, there's going to be increasing famine and disease. More and more Japanese people, because the population has gone up, and we went over this in China, are going to have less resources. When people don't get enough food to eat, then oftentimes disease will occur. So in Japan, you will have serious problems, and you can see this image of people who are trying to survive a famine. You can see there's people eating a horse. There's someone getting ready to carve up a dead body. There's bodies who have not been buried properly that are being eaten by dogs. And this became a sight that Japanese people would see. So just like in China, eventually you get to the situation where you have population growth because there's plenty of food and more people working on the land and opening new land. But eventually that runs out and you have more people having less food. And to give you an idea, just like in China, in Japan, there was a good deal of infanticide, and even samurai were committing infanticide. So again, there was this feeling that, just like you had in China, that there was something that was wrong, right? So you've got this social system that doesn't seem to be working, where samurai are trapped, where they're in a bad position if they're poor samurai, and they're not allowed to do anything about it, where they're in debt to these merchants. You've got people not getting enough food to eat. People turning to cannibalism in some rare instances. Usually this didn't happen very often, but it happened enough that it was disturbing. There's this feeling that something is wrong. And this feeling that something was wrong is going to help lead to what we call national learning in Japanese. It leads to many different kind of ideas, but one in particular is this idea of national learning. So remember, one thing I have to stress is that Japan creatively adapted Confucianism from China. So remember, I gave you that example that of how the Tokugawa had taken this four status groups, right? The Chinese had scholar officials, peasants, artisans, merchants, and they borrowed it, except they switched out scholar officials and added samurai. And they also said, oh, and by the way, no social mobility. You're kind of stuck where you're at. They borrowed that system, and the Tokugawa supported Confucian scholars to try and justify its rule. So the Japanese very, very openly borrowed and adopted and adapted Confucianism. And their system was built around a kind of Confucianism. Tokugawa dynasty borrowed a lot from Confucianism, and Japan had long borrowed Confucianism from China, but here it becomes more and more open. But when the whole system is having troubles, as we just described, people are beginning to question that system. And one of them is a man named Motoori Norinaga. And Motoori Norinaga is going to look back to Japanese history. And he's going to say, you know what? We need to focus on our emperor. We don't need to be messing with this Confucian stuff. We need to focus on our emperor. Our emperor is literally a god. He is descended from the goddess Amaterasu. This guy is very important. This guy is very special, and we should really focus on him. This is important because later on people will use these ideas to justify overthrowing the Tokugawa. You know, why should we have this shogun ruling us when we've got a honest to goodness living god, right, in the form of the emperor? But Motoori Norinaga will argue that Japan was a special place. For example, he argues, remember I said Amaterasu is the sun goddess that the emperor is descended from, Japanese people believe? Motoori Norinaga actually argued that the sun was literally Amaterasu herself. So like when you looked at the sun, you were actually looking at the goddess Amaterasu. And therefore, because the Japanese emperor was descended from Amaterasu, the whole world owed a debt of gratitude to Japan. So Japan was a special place. And Motoori said, you know, we're such a special place. Why do we borrow these foreign ideas? Why do we borrow these Chinese ideas? Right? They're not good. And he looked at the Chinese, and what was fascinating is how he turned things upside down. So many Japanese people said, oh, the Chinese are so moral. They're so good. Look, they have Confucius who taught us about morality. And Motoori Norinaga is like, yeah, the Chinese are bad. That's why they needed someone to teach them about morality. We Japanese people are naturally good. We have good hearts because we get our hearts from the emperor who got them from Amaterasu. And because we have good hearts, we know naturally how to be good. No one needs to teach us Japanese people how to be good. We know how to do it. Unlike those immoral Chinese, they need people to teach them. So he sees the foreign, and by foreign we mean China, as something that's polluting. Right? Japan's a special place. We don't need these foreigners. We're a special place because of our relationship to our emperor and to the goddess Amaterasu. And these ideas are very, very important and very popular. And remember, I said that people were becoming literate. A lot of commoners, a lot of just average everyday people were becoming literate. And samurai and these commoners and women and lots of different people were starting to learn these ideas. And thanks to the roads and the increase in education and literacy, these ideas will grow and spread and help form a broad-based support for a restoration of the Japanese emperor and the overthrow of the shogun. And that's something that will happen in what's called the Meiji Restoration.